You ever have that one thing that you keep going back to, no matter how much time passes? For me, that is Maplestory, an MMORPG that came out almost 20 years ago. Maplestory is a 2D side-scroller that originated in Korea and has grown exponentially since then. The original Maplestory came out in 2003 and follows the Explore recipe for a successful MMO. Players make characters, fight monsters, and level up. The game started with 4 Explorer classes: Warrior, Mage, Archer, and Thief, and specializations for each of those 4. It was wildly successful among teenagers and young adults since one of the big draws of the game was the social aspect. People used the game as a social tool, making friends online and playing with each other. It was extremely common for kids to log on to Maplestory after school and play the game for hours on end. I know I did at least. Over the years, Maplestory went through several changes and updates. The first one I remember was the introduction of the Pirate class, another Explorer class with its own specializations, and soon after came the Knights of Cygnus. The Knights of Cygnus were different from the Explorer adventurers in that they had traits of the Explorer classes, but the skills were wildly different. They even started in a different area compared to what came before them, and as a side note, the Knights of Cygnus capped their level at 120, while the Explorer classes capped at 200. Soon after, more and more updates and new mechanics were added to the game. There was Big Bang in 2010, which changed the leveling system so players needed less experience to level up, and that was a pretty welcome change. Before Big Bang, getting a character to level 35 took at least a month, killing countless monsters for hours, but afterward it only took about a week. Any MMO player knows that games get more enjoyable as they reach higher levels, so this change was a positive one overall. Other changes were new player classes such as the Resistance, which were different from the Explorers and the Knights of Cygnus, and a complete rework of the game, including maps and user interface. 5 years later was the Chaos update, which added more mechanics, areas, and revamped all the player classes. In between and since these major patches, Maplestory kept adding more and more classes and maps, and pretty soon the way people played the game changed drastically. It was less about a social game with players working together to complete quests or fight area bosses, and evolved to become a solo game. Leveling up a character was much more efficient to do solo, so barely anyone made parties anymore. In fact, the area bosses, which used to take several players to defeat, can now be done solo. Granted, more area bosses were included, who were stronger, but players were eventually able to solo them as well. It wasn't just the social game that changed either. Like with any MMO, there are daily quests, or dailies, which players complete in order to get a useful reward. World of Warcraft has these, so it's not something unique to Maplestory, but Maplestory had a lot of them and kept adding more. It started with doing 1 or 2 until that turned into doing almost a dozen, and keep in mind that each of these dailies would take about 10 to 20 minutes to complete. This made it so players were forced to pick a single character to focus their time on, but this probably wasn't a big deal since most people focused on a single character anyway, at least until the link skills and the Legion board were introduced. I could go into extreme detail about how each of these things work, but all that you need to know is that each of these adds extra stats to a character, but to get those additions, the player must train multiple characters to 200, like at least 10 to be worthwhile for link skills and 30 for the Legion board. The number of classes went up to 40 and is still going today, and each new class adds an effect to the Legion board and comes with a new link skill, and that means more training for a character players are going to abandon once they have what they need. Looking at the state Maplestory is in now compared to what it used to be, they're completely different games. I understand that games do updates and patches to make things better and introduce new stuff, but in the case for Maplestory, they only introduced new stuff and didn't improve what they already had. The game has devolved into making just one character to main, and making a bunch of others just to get stats, then doing dailies until people eventually quit. At least that's what happened to me. I started playing in middle school back in 2004, and I enjoyed Maplestory a lot. Not just for the social aspect, but the game was simple enough for a kid to understand, and they had enough content so I wouldn't get bored. I would make a character, play it for a while, then make a different character, and so on. I got to experience a lot of the game during those years, and when the Big Bang update came around, I looked forward to it. I felt that leveling up was one of the huge turnoffs, and this being mediated would only strengthen the appeal. As the years went by, I played on various servers until I finally settled on the final one I would play, Reboot. The Reboot server was different from the other servers in that trading with any player was omitted. The reason for this was because the game had created a pay-to-win system. Players who were willing to invest real money into the game were able to gain an unfair advantage compared to others, such as better equipment and items that made leveling easier. Reboot changed all that. What you had was what you had earned for yourself. There was no shortcuts. On Reboot, I had two main characters, a dual blade and a wind archer, and I would do dailies on both of them every day for several months on end. Remember what I said before about dailies taking a lot of time? Well, this is how I learned that having more than one main character was time consuming. Spending 3 hours a day doing dailies for one character was much less appealing when I knew I would have to spend another 3 hours doing the exact same quests for the exact same reason. Also, besides the dailies, there wasn't much else to do. Sure, you could grind levels, but that was even more time consuming than dailies, and it wasn't fun to do either. It got to the point where I would just have Netflix open on my browser while I played so I wouldn't get bored. I got each of my mains to 230, and by the time I was able to fight a specific boss solo on each of them, I quit the main game and haven't gone back since. Notice how I said main game? I tried a private server a few months afterward called Maple Royals. Royals was like how Maplestory used to be before the Big Bang update. There were only 5 explorer classes to play, and a lot of the content that was in the main game was removed, so Maple Royals was much less cluttered. Also, the experience and drop rates were multiplied, so while Royals was similar to the original Maplestory, it fixed the two of the biggest problems. Maple Royals is much smaller compared to Maplestory, with only about 1,000 or so players, but when the game only has one server, 1,000 can be enough, especially since Royals has the social aspect that Maplestory phased out. Based on my experience with how the game used to be, I knew how to play Royals. I made a bishop first, since mages back then were useful for making money in-game, and with their unrestricted map clearing skills, once I had a sizable amount of funds, I made a shadower, since thieves were my favorite class. Playing Maple Royals was fun for a while. There was very little solo play since the systems that allowed characters to one-shot everything were not in place, and people were required to work together. I joined a guild or two during my time, and I enjoyed doing quests that no one in Maplestory had done for probably several years. What caused me to quit Royals was the fact that the game did not evolve. I know I complained earlier that the updates and patches ruined Maplestory, but this was the opposite situation, and it was just as bad. In the 2 years I played Maple Royals, no new content was added that I noticed. I understand that moderators for Royals wanted to keep the game pristine and like old school Maplestory, but would introducing a new area or two be so bad? Maplestory did this a little at a time, and if Royals did the same, but only kept the map and monsters, I most likely would have stayed. After quitting each of these games, I suddenly felt a huge weight had been lifted. I found myself with a lot more time to do other things, and I never noticed how much of my life had been consumed by Maplestory. Even though I've moved on, I still like to reminisce and check each game for updates, but I will most likely never play them again. Maplestory was fun while it lasted, and while some old school players still enjoy it, unfortunately I am not one of them. I prefer console games, but that's just my opinion.